Welcome to Whisper's Secrets. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and hit the bell. Let's start. My name is Walter Granger. I'm 62 years old, and for the better part of 3 decades, I served as Chief Financial Officer of one of the most consistent, quietly powerful logistics firms in North America, Carter-Sloane Group. We weren't flashy. We didn't throw billion-dollar IPO parties or chase vanity metrics. We didn't need to. We knew who we were. We moved freight. We kept promises. We made money. Reliable, disciplined money. And I helped build every inch of it. When I joined in 1993, we were a regional shipping firm with 12 warehouses across 4 states. By the time I left, we had 116 locations, a proprietary tracking system, and net profits that had doubled in 5 years. I'd helped guide us through the dot-com bust, 9/11 disruptions, the Great Recession, the COVID shockwaves. We never laid off a single full-time employee in all that time. Not one. But in corporate America, institutional memory isn't a line item on a balance sheet. Loyalty? Experience? Steady hands? That stuff doesn't show up in a pitch deck. Enter Trevor Banks. He was brought in after our longtime CEO, Leonard Sloan, retired. Trevor came with perfect hair, a Harvard MBA, and an infuriating habit of quoting Elon Musk in meetings. He'd worked in private equity, done a stint at Bain, and styled himself as a growth multiplier. Everything about him reeked of the kind of brilliance that burns fast and leaves nothing behind. Within weeks, he replaced our classic blue and silver logo with a lowercase textile font that looked like it belonged on an app. Started talking about streamlining legacy inefficiencies. That meant automation. That meant layoffs. That meant people I'd worked with for 20 years walking out with security guards. It was inevitable. I saw it coming. Trevor didn't like me. I wasn't flashy. I didn't care about brand aesthetics. I cared about margins, forecasting accuracy, and sustainable cost reduction. He wanted quarterly wins. I wanted 10-year growth. The tension started with minor things. He'd override my departmental budgets without discussion. Cut vendor relationships I'd negotiated over years. Replace reliable platforms with trendy software none of us trusted. Then the exclusions began. I was no longer copied on investor decks. My weekly update meetings were cancelled. He brought in 2 consultants from his PE days who started shadowing my direct reports. I got the message. Still, I kept showing up. Still did the work. Still delivered clean audits, clear books, and predictive forecasts with 97% accuracy. I knew the ship. I knew the ballast. I knew where all the pressure points were. That's why Trevor had to get rid of me. Because I made the chaos harder to sell. The actual termination was dressed up to look like a celebration. I was called into the same conference room I'd helped design 12 years earlier. Trevor sat at the head of the table, flanked by Cassandra from HR and Jerry, our in-house legal. Walter, Trevor began with that politician's smile. We've been evaluating the future of Carter-Sloane, and we believe it's time to transition to a more agile financial leadership model. I blinked. Agile? You've been incredible, Cassandra chimed in. Your legacy is immense. This isn't about performance. Of course not, Trevor added quickly. It's about future alignment. I almost laughed. Almost. Instead, I listened. They presented me with a pre-written severance offer. 12 months salary, accelerated vesting of my remaining equity, and a 3-month transition advisory contract, non-renewable. You want me gone, I said flatly. Trevor leaned forward. We want to give you the graceful exit you deserve. Quietly. On your terms. He smiled like he expected gratitude. I nodded slowly. And you want a non-compete? 1 year, industry-wide. Very standard. And the NDA? Just confidentiality around financials and internal decision-making. I picked up the pen. And signed. Trevor exhaled. I left the building that afternoon carrying a single box. Framed pictures. A 2008 CFO of the Year. Plaque. A small model truck with the original company logo, gifted to me by Len Sloan on my 20th anniversary. No party. No farewell lunch. Just a few awkward claps from the receptionist as I walked out the front doors for the last time. And what they didn't know, what Trevor didn't know, was that I had already made a plan. Because I'd seen this coming. I'd prepared. Not out of paranoia, but out of pattern recognition. You don't spend 3 decades in finance without understanding the cycles of power. And this wasn't the end of a chapter. It was the prelude to a reckoning. That night, I poured myself a glass of scotch and opened my laptop. I pulled up the private files I'd stored in my personal drive. Years of reports. Anomalies in vendor spend since Trevor arrived. Rushed procurement deals that didn't match policy. Unusual budget changes submitted through backdoor channels. It was all there. Quiet, methodical documentation. And beyond that, my contacts. Private equity firms I'd worked with on acquisitions. Logistics networks that trusted me. People who still picked up when I called. I started making notes. Not revenge. Strategy. If Trevor wanted me gone quietly, he was going to regret the silence. 2 weeks later, I flew to Chicago to meet with a former competitor, Jensen Freight Systems. We'd battled for contracts for years, but there was always mutual respect. Now, they were looking to expand east. They needed intel. Structure. Experience. They needed me. I didn't take a salary. I didn't want a title. I wanted one thing, a short-term operational role to help them modernize their back end and quietly peel off key Carter-Sloane clients. They agreed. Quietly. Efficiently. One by one, I began calling the old guard. The warehouse managers Trevor had laid off. The senior analysts he'd pushed out. The trucking division heads frustrated by his chaos. I offered them something simple. Stability. Respect. A seat at the table. 6 weeks after Trevor replaced me, Carter-Sloane missed their first major quarterly guidance in 8 years. Client churn. Vendor confusion. Per contract terms. The board held an emergency session. And Trevor, for all his buzzwords and bright teeth, didn't have a model that explained what went wrong. But I did. And I had just started. Trevor thought he'd buried me with a handshake and a severance agreement. He thought that by removing the old CFO, he could shift the blame for any failures that followed. He underestimated how deeply I understood the organism he was now trying to command. I didn't just know Carter-Sloane's systems. I had designed many of them. My name wasn't on the marketing banners, but my fingerprints were on every invoice system, every cost center, every vendor scoring model. And while he was busy rebranding with slick videos and slogans, I was doing what I had always done best, studying the numbers. Studying behavior. Reading the pressure points. Jensen Freight Systems welcomed me like an old ally. Their CEO, Marcus, was blunt and practical. "We want results, not noise," he said on day 1. "You do that, and this company is yours to shape." Perfect. I began by identifying the gaps Carter-Sloane had created in their own operations. Trevor had replaced human insight with algorithmic scheduling. Clients who once had direct lines to dispatchers were now routed through automated portals. Custom pricing tiers were wiped out in favor of tiered package models. It was efficient, sure. But it was cold. And in logistics, where delays cost real dollars, clients valued relationships more than buzzwords. I called half a dozen of our former top clients, names I'd spent years nurturing. "How's it going under the new system?" The answers were variations of the same. "Terrible. Nobody gets back to us. They raised rates and cut our support." One client, a key player in retail distribution, said it outright. "We miss you." That's all I needed. I sent an email, a 2-page outline of how Jensen could handle their East Coast volumes. Within a week, they signed a letter of intent. I brought in my old logistics analyst, Denise, who'd been unceremoniously let go after Trevor's reorg. She lit up when I called. "Tell me you have something better," she said. "Not better. Smarter. I'm in." Denise got to work mapping out every operational vulnerability Carter-Sloane had created under Trevor's new structure. We weren't looking to poach mindlessly. We were surgical, targeted, strategic. By the end of the second month, 4 major clients had shifted their primary routes to Jensen. Carter-Sloane's East Coast revenue dropped 17%. Trevor issued a memo blaming macroeconomic headwinds. We issued a press release celebrating record-breaking Q2 onboarding. The board began to ask questions. Meanwhile, I stayed behind the scenes. I didn't take interviews. Didn't gloat. Didn't brag. This wasn't about revenge. It was about restoring balance. Every dollar Carter-Sloane lost to our growing network was a dollar they could have protected if they'd valued what came before. By September, we were scaling. Jensen approved new capital investment to expand its Northeast warehouse footprint. We acquired a distressed freight forwarding company in Baltimore, giving us access to a dozen port-side contracts. Carter-Sloane had passed on that acquisition 6 months earlier. Too small, Trevor had said. We picked it up for 30 cents on the dollar. Denise ran the integration personally. I brought in a CTO I trusted from my old team. We rebuilt the back-end systems from the ground up. No buzzwords, no consultants. Just operational clarity. Trevor kept trying to outmarket the losses. But the clients we were gaining didn't care about branding. They cared about service, speed, reliability. And when we gave them all three, they stayed. I knew we were turning the tide when Carter-Sloane lost the GMEX account. GMEX had been with them for 19 years. Their loss was our victory. A quiet one, handled over 2 Zoom calls and a handshake in New York. Trevor didn't see it coming until the termination letter landed on his desk. I heard from a friend on the board that he had a meltdown. Blamed everyone but himself. I stayed quiet. Because silence is power. Because when you speak only through results, people listen more closely. I wasn't finished yet. By Q4, Jensen's Eastern network had tripled in capacity. We weren't just growing. We were winning. Carter-Sloane missed their second straight earnings forecast. Their board issued a statement reaffirming their confidence in leadership. I knew what that meant. They were buying time. But not for long. Because I wasn't just reshaping logistics. I was shaping a new standard. One that didn't forget its architects. And when it all came full circle, Trevor would realize the lesson too late. Never bet against the people who built the foundation. Because we don't rebuild for revenge. We rebuild for legacy. And our time always comes again. January arrived like a slap to the face for Carter-Sloane. The end of year report was a disaster. Operational margins had shrunk by 28%. Customer churn reached its highest level in a decade. Internal morale, what little was left, had cratered. Trevor stood before the board and spun the narrative like a seasoned showman. Inflation, fuel costs, shipping gridlock, labor shortages. But I knew the truth. And more importantly, so did the people in that room. Behind the scenes, the defection continued. Denise had built out a whisper network of former Carter-Sloane employees, dispatchers, analysts, client success reps, people who knew how things really worked. We didn't poach them aggressively. We didn't have to. The moment they learned where I was, they came to us. We offered fair salaries. Clear mission. A promise, no politics, just performance. Meanwhile, I focused on the next target. The Houston expansion. Carter-Sloane had spent 3 years prepping for a strategic distribution center in the Southwest Corridor, an aggressive move to capture more cross-border volume. Trevor had inherited the plan. But he hadn't understood it. He slashed the preliminary investment by 40% to optimize capital efficiency. He outsourced the site engineering to a firm with no freight experience. He delayed vendor contracts until Q2, hoping to squeeze margin. It backfired spectacularly. When permits stalled and the first foundation pour failed inspection, the entire project halted. I saw the opening. We reached out to 3 clients affected by the delay. Offered interim warehousing. Integrated drop point logistics. Stabilized pricing. Within a month, Two of them permanently rerouted their volume to Jensen. One of them, a global apparel distributor, was a whale. The kind of account you lock in for 5 years. Carter-Sloane had spent 9 months courting them. We landed them in 3 phone calls. The press caught on. Legacy firm stumbles in expansion push. Ran in Freightline Weekly. Jensen Logistics quietly reshaping mid-Atlantic market. Said Transport Trends. I didn't give interviews. I didn't need to. The numbers spoke for themselves. Back inside Carter-Sloane, the walls were buckling. 2 of Trevor's top executives left within a week of each other. One joined us. The other started his own firm and called to thank me for the inspiration. You reminded me what leadership actually looks like, he said. I didn't know how to respond to that. So I just said, do good work. The rest will follow. By April, Jensen had opened its 7th new facility in 6 months. We were moving fast. But not recklessly. Every site was carefully vetted. Every hire deliberate. Every client relationship built on transparency and performance, not promises and flash. We weren't just taking market share. We were becoming the market. Meanwhile, Trevor grew louder. Internal emails leaked. He blamed entrenched resistance for the company's performance. He warned that cultural sabotage was undermining progress. He created a new performance team that operated like corporate bounty hunters, firing anyone who questioned strategy. The effect? More defections. More fear. More cracks. I kept my eye on the long game. Because I knew what came next. Boards are loyal until they're not. They tolerate disruption until it becomes distraction. They back bold vision until the numbers don't justify the noise. And Trevor's time was almost up. The tipping point came in June. One of Carter-Sloane's international partners, a longtime Canadian importer, walked. They cited unreliability. And in a brutal final jab, they named Jensen as their new exclusive partner. The press called it a changing of the guard. I called it inevitable. Inside Jensen, we celebrated in quiet ways. A team barbecue. Handwritten notes to every new client signed by name, not title. We built a culture not around conquest, but around competence. And people noticed. Resumes poured in. Clients called us first. The silence around our rise became impossible to ignore. One afternoon, sitting in my corner office at Jensen HQ, I received a call from an old friend still sitting on the Carter-Sloane board. He's on the ropes, Walter. Trevor? They're considering an executive transition. What's the hold-up? They want a plan. A bridge. Silence. Then, you interested? I smiled. Let me get back to you. Because some offers deserve a pause. Not because you're unsure. But because they come full circle. And when you rebuild right, you never have to knock. The door opens for you. I didn't rush to answer the board's offer. Not because I didn't know what I wanted, but because I wanted them to wait. Let them sit in the silence I had once endured. Let them realize that the man they cast aside now held the leverage. I called Marcus, Jensen's CEO, first. I owe you honesty, I said. He listened. No resentment. No bargaining. Just a firm handshake and a single sentence. Do what you were born to do. It's rare, in this world, to find leaders like that. Rare, and worth remembering. I met with the Carter-Sloane board a week later. The meeting took place not at their headquarters, but at the neutral setting of a private club in Midtown Manhattan. Elegant. Reserved. The kind of place that old money firms preferred for hard conversations. 10 board members. Only one of them had been there when I left. The rest were fresh faces, investors, strategists, operators. They didn't waste time. We want to steady the company. We want continuity. We need confidence. I nodded. You need a complete rebuild. Not just a CEO. Not just a figurehead. Are you offering that? I leaned back. Only on my terms. And I laid them out. Full control over leadership structure. Removal of every last consultant Trevor had installed. Reinstatement of the legacy budget model with modern analytics overlay. Autonomy to rebuild the trust they lost. There was silence. Then nods. And Trevor? He'll resign before the week is out. I left the club without shaking hands. They needed me more than I needed them. And that shift, the one where you go from defending your job to defining it, is something every veteran of corporate war recognizes. Trevor's resignation hit the wires on Monday morning. He cited a desire to pursue new opportunities. I didn't comment. Not publicly. But internally, we had our own communications plan ready. It was elegant, respectful, and surgical. Effective immediately, Walter Granger will return to Carter-Sloane in the capacity of executive chairman. His mandate is transformation and restoration. It wasn't just a comeback. It was an acknowledgement that they had made a mistake. Day one felt like walking into the ghost of something I once knew. The walls were still the same. The faces were different. There was fear. There was relief. There was hope. I didn't hold all-hands meetings. I walked the floors. Office to office. Department to department. I looked people in the eye and said, "We're building this back together." No slogans. No banners. Just presence. Leadership is a daily practice. And I was ready to practice it. My first order of business was identifying what we could still salvage. Finance was a mess. Forecasts had lost integrity. Cost assumptions were broken. HR was worse. Culture had fractured into silos. Performance reviews were punitive and disconnected from results. Operations had held together surprisingly well, thanks to middle managers who still remembered the old systems. I built a 90-day plan. Reinstate the communication rhythm, daily stand-ups, weekly reviews. Bring back the planning council. Build a transition team with people from every layer of the business. I called Denise. "You ready to come home?" She said yes before I finished the sentence. The biggest challenge was psychological. People were bruised. Some were angry. Many were numb. We held small focus groups. No HR reps, no agenda. Just questions. What do you need to do your job well? The answers were consistent. Clarity. Stability. Respect. So we delivered. Not all at once. But piece by piece. We dismantled Trevor's dashboard mania and replaced it with actual decision support systems. We scrapped the bounty hunting, performance team, and returned authority to department leads. We issued a formal apology to every employee laid off due to realignment. Some came back. Most just thanked us for the closure. Within 60 days, we re-earned 3 major accounts Trevor had lost. Within 90 days, we posted our first net positive client gain in a year. The board issued a memo calling it a testament to thoughtful leadership. I called it the result of doing the basics right. But I wasn't interested in staying forever. I was rebuilding a bridge, not building a monument. So I named Denise interim CFO. Started grooming 2 department heads for potential COO succession. Created a leadership pipeline program for mid-level managers. I told the board, "You don't need me forever. You need a system that survives leadership changes." They agreed. They offered to name the next building after me. I declined. Let the company speak for itself. In the fall, I announced I would step down as chairman by the end of Q2 the following year. The timing would align with a full operational reset, cultural stability, and a clean strategic roadmap. I wrote one final internal letter. It didn't talk about the past. It talked about stewardship, responsibility, and the privilege of rebuilding something worth protecting. I ended with a quote from Drucker. "The best way to predict the future is to create it." And I signed it. With quiet pride, WG. I left the office on my last day with no fanfare. No parade. Just a single note taped to my office door. In Denise's handwriting. "We don't just remember what you fixed. We remember how you made us care again." That was enough. That was everything. Because in the end, I didn't return for revenge. I returned for redemption. And we built something better. Together. The 6 months that followed my second return to Carter-Sloane were some of the most purposeful days of my career. Not because of triumph. Not because of vindication. But because we were no longer fixing what Trevor broke, we were building what came next. I knew I wasn't here to stay forever. I had made that clear. My reentry had to have an endpoint. Real transformation requires new blood, not the ghost of what once worked. So my focus shifted, not to lead, but to transfer leadership. Not to operate, but to embed culture. Not to command, but to coach. I spent the majority of my time with middle management, the forgotten layer in most organizations. These were the people too senior to be handheld, too junior to be celebrated. But they carried the weight. They enforced discipline. They maintained rhythm. I launched a mentorship series. Small sessions, 8 to 10 people at a time. We called it The Table. No agenda. Just conversation. What's broken? What needs rebuilding? What have we learned from the storm? I didn't give answers. I asked questions. And in those sessions, I saw the company beginning to believe again. Not in me. In themselves. Denise had stepped into the CFO role as if she had always been there. She brought a sharpness I had never mastered, a modern, data-forward approach, but grounded in pragmatism. She respected legacy but didn't worship it. She was exactly what the company needed now. I gave her space. She returned results. By February, our internal forecast accuracy was back over 95%. We were cash positive on 4 consecutive quarters. Vendor trust was restored. Audit risk? Near zero. And all of it without a single executive shouting over a slide deck. The board invited me to quarterly meetings, but I mostly observed. They had stopped looking for magic. They had started listening again. What should we expect in the next 2 quarters? Where do we go from here? My answers were always the same. Back to the basics. Angela, the new COO in training, had once run our West Coast distribution. Quiet, methodical, unflinching. I spent weeks traveling with her. Riding trucks. Sitting in warehouses. Shadowing regional managers. We didn't talk about promotions. We talked about standards. What's non-negotiable? What does good look like? What's the cost of short-term wins that hollow out long-term capability? She didn't give speeches. She led by walking beside people. That's why I knew she'd outlast me. By the end of March, our internal net promoter score among employees had doubled. Turnover dropped. Recruiting became easier. The brand meant something again. Not because we said it did. Because people felt it. And feeling in a company is everything. My own days grew shorter. I stopped staying late. I delegated every meeting I could. I returned to writing. Each morning, I drafted internal reflections, some I shared, some I didn't. I spoke less in meetings. I watched more. That's how you know you've built something lasting. When it works without you. In April, I met with Denise and Angela privately. It's time. They didn't argue. They didn't protest. They simply nodded. Because they were ready. And because I was too. We mapped out a 60-day final transition. We scheduled a quiet handoff. No parties. No surprise tributes. Just handshakes. And continuity. May was filled with small goodbyes. I visited every major region. Not to command, but to thank. You held the line. You rebuilt when no one was watching. You're the reason we're still here. I meant every word. Because in leadership, humility isn't weakness. It's strength. On my final day in the office, Denise gave me a sealed envelope. Inside was a card, signed by over 300 employees. The first line. You didn't just return. You reminded us what matters. There was no parade. No press release. Just me, standing in the parking lot, staring at the building I helped raise, rebuilt, and now released. And then I got in my car. And drove away. At peace. Somewhere out there, Trevor was probably preparing a new pitch deck. A new venture. A new disruption. But I no longer needed to watch. Because I hadn't just outlasted him. I had outbuilt him. And that's the real win. Retirement didn't feel like a retreat. It felt like freedom. No more early alarms. No more back-to-back strategy sessions. No more firefighting because someone failed to think ahead. My life had been a long stretch of problems to solve, people to protect, decisions to make. Now, I had room to breathe. And oddly, I found myself waking up earlier, not later. Old habits die slow. But this time, I rose with no meetings, no calls, no unread emails clawing at my conscience. Just the sound of birds outside the window and the smell of fresh coffee. Freedom doesn't look like escape. It looks like presence. I bought a small farmhouse on the edge of the Blue Ridge. Remote enough to hear nothing but wind at night. Close enough to a town with a decent bookstore and a bakery that made the kind of sourdough you'd drive an hour for. I started each morning with pen and paper. Not emails. Not spreadsheets. Just thoughts. Reflections. Lessons. Letters I'd never send. I wrote a lot about silence. How much space it opens. How much it reveals. How powerfully it speaks, if you let it. Sometimes Denise would call. "I just wanted to hear your voice," she'd say. She'd fill me in on a new regional lead, or a supply chain improvement that shaved 2 days off a cycle. "We used the system you taught us." I'd smile. "It's not mine anymore," I'd say. And it wasn't. That was the point. Angela visited once. We walked the property. Talked about leadership and fatigue, and why some leaders get addicted to attention while others just want outcomes. "You could still run a company," she said. "I did. Twice. That was enough." She nodded. "You think you'll ever go back?" "No. But I'll always be building something. Just not in a boardroom." That summer, I started volunteering at the high school. 1 day a week, I taught basic financial literacy. Not the kind the textbooks cover. The real stuff. How to read a pay stub. How compound interest works. How to spot a bad deal dressed up as opportunity. I told them stories. About the mistakes I made. About the time I almost signed a deal that would have sunk us. About the power of walking away when something didn't smell right. They listened more than I expected. And that felt like legacy, too. I read more. Took long walks. Spent time with my sister's kids. I even learned to cook properly, not just reheat. My life slowed down. But it didn't get smaller. It expanded inward. On the 1-year anniversary of my final exit, Denise sent me a package. Inside was a plaque. Plain wood. Small inscription. "Walter Granger, the quiet architect." No gold. No frame. Just truth. I hung it by the front door. Not for others. For me. To remember. That silence isn't surrender. That legacy doesn't need a stage. That sometimes the most important work we do is the work that lets others rise. One evening in October, I sat on the porch as the sun dipped behind the ridgeline, painting everything in amber and fire. And I realized, I didn't miss the company. I didn't miss the power. What I missed, what I would always miss, was the purpose. But that doesn't have to end. Purpose is wherever you place your effort. Wherever you leave something better than you found it. So I raised my glass to the quiet. To what was. To what's next. And to the men and women still inside the fight, still doing the work. You're not forgotten. You're the ones I built for. You're the reason I can rest. Thank you for being with us on Whispers Secrets. If you enjoyed this, leave a like, drop a comment, and be sure to subscribe. The secrets are waiting to be revealed. See you soon.